It's Friday, which means it's time for another exciting episode of Ask Us Anything, in which you send us your questions and we try our hardest to answer them in a logical and intelligent way. We don't always succeed, but you know what? We try. First up, at Daphne M88 asks, what are your takes on the effect of hallucinogens on art, and has it heightened your experience when consuming a piece of art?
Is Daphne M88 trying to get us to say on air that we've done hallucinogens?
I think we can answer this question hypothetically, Labahe.
I don't have to answer it hypothetically because I've never tried hallucinogens.
To be fair, I've never tried hallucinogens. I may have indulged in other things in other countries, not Malaysia.
Okay, let me just
Shall we clarify what hallucinogens
Yeah, I was just
are?
going to say, let's just define hallucinogens. I'm assuming hallucinogens are specifically like acid and
Yes.
or trippy mushrooms.
LSD, correct.
Yeah, okay, like hardcore shit.
So I've never tried acid, I've never tried mushrooms, even though all of the research I've read about microdosing seems very interesting, especially with how good
super
it is
interesting.
about getting rid of anxiety and
Yeah.
depression and even making you more productive as a human being. But of course, being in Malaysia, very hard to come by, lah, so I haven't actually taken that risk.
Also, I've heard that Coke is also very good for productivity.
As in microdosing coke or just straight up coke, lah?
Apparently straight up Coke. Just like
Oh, shit.
I've heard anecdotal stories about how like stock traders and financial analysts in London would do Coke and just work 24 hours.
And then their heart explodes.
I mean, you gotta do it in moderation lah.
Moderation, of course.
Moderation,
Everything in
bro,
moderation, even
moderation.
drugs. Even
Yeah, yeah.
drugs.
Anyway,
But before we get into that, there have been a lot of movies that were made under the influence. There are a lot that we know of, and I'm sure there are even more that were made in which the directors and actors don't necessarily talk about it. But Easy Rider is the first one that comes to mind. I mean, it is the classic road movie, probably the best example of a mainstream film that was made completely on drugs. Dennis Hopper was high all the time. Apparently, he suffered from real paranoid spells. Jack Nicholson has said in interviews that he's been high for certain scenes of the movie. What else? Pineapple Express, there is no way those boys made that movie while they were sober.
can I say most of early Seth Rogen films can't have been done sober?
I think all of early Kevin Smith movies as well, because Kevin Smith always talks about getting high. And I'm sure he was making those movies while high on weed.
Yeah.
Alejandro Jodorowsky, I'm
Oh, yeah.
sure, was making a lot of his movies while high. Some of the concepts I've seen for his version of Dune, there is no way you came up with that while sober.
If you did, you should really speak to someone.
One of my favorite movies of all time, it's a David Cronenberg movie called The Naked Lunch. Now, I don't know if Cronenberg was high making that, but William S. Burroughs, who wrote the book, doesn't remember writing the book. And it is a fucking weird book, and it is an even weirder fucking movie, but it's great.
Okay, so let's go back to answering the question. There was an experiment. I think there was a scientific experiment they did with an artist and got the artist to sort of draw based on the different hallucinogens they were on. And I think that's an interesting proof of concept that these hallucinogens will affect you differently and affect your brain differently and affect the way you think differently.
Right.
Daphne 88's using the word art here, so I'm assuming they're not talking about fucking bad boys lah. I don't think she's talking about doing acid and then watching Transformers 1.
No.
No.
I think there are certain movies that maybe lend themselves to a hallucinogenic experience.
Yeah.
I keep thinking about The Cell. I think that would be an
Oh.
interesting movie to watch. It's already trippy.
I think watching The Cell while you're tripping is going to put you in really dark, weird places.
Tarsem Singh, right?
Tarsem Singh. Yeah, that was great. Great film. I was going to recommend, I don't know why I'm recommending anything, but like there was a film about Vincent van Gogh done a couple years ago. Each frame was hand drawn by an artist in the
Yes.
style of Vincent van Gogh. I think that would be really cool on acid or while you're tripping, I assume.
As for the earlier question as to the works of art that were created while high, I think it really depends on the artist. I think William S. Burroughs, who did The Naked Lunch, he's written a lot of other books. Absolutely fantastic writer. You get some really interesting output. I think if you take Kevin Smith, for example, it's a mixed bag. If you take a movie like Cop Out, it's a shit film, but then Clerks and Clerks 2 and Jay and Silent Bob and Dogma were all fantastic movies. So I think it really depends on the mental state of the artist while they are making that movie or writing that book or doing that painting. Easy Rider
Yeah.
is a great film. The Holy Mountain by Hodorowski, also a fantastic movie, but just trippy and weird and full of sacrilegious imagery. And just, I don't think someone sober would be as uninhibited enough to do something like that.
I was gonna say, I think from the things that I've read, essentially what a hallucinogen would do is to sort of, people use the term thinking outside the box, whereas I think with a hallucinogen, essentially what you're doing is you're no longer encumbered by your inhibitions, right? You're no longer encumbered by tradition. You're no longer encumbered by social constructs. You can do whatever you want. I mean, there have been fantastic music done while people have been on hallucinogens and or other types of stimulants. And I think that too is what it is, right? It just helps you get past, it helps you get out of your own way.
As for us, I mean, hypothetically speaking, I'm assuming it will heighten your experience when consuming a piece of art, but we can't say for sure, lah, Daphne.
Can I ask? I'm just gonna throw this at you. Would you do it? Would you try it? Would you, in a safe environment, I don't know, whatever you consider a safe environment to be doing acid and watching a movie, but would you?
From everything I've read, if you are going to try mushrooms or acid, LSD, everyone recommends that you do it in a safe environment, right? Because
Yeah.
you want to have, especially if it's your first time, you want to have that controlled environment. I'm not big into losing control.
Same.
I have a very type A personality, which is why I don't necessarily drink much at all. I don't do drugs because I like to be in control of my faculties. I think that's a type A situation. But as a social experiment, I think it would be quite interesting, especially as a film critic, to see
Yeah.
how that changes your experience of a certain work. I would be curious to know if it would make me react to something I love differently, to something I hate differently. Just going back to what we were saying about inhibitions, we bring all of that to the content that we watch. Whether it's our moral take on something or our own traumas or history. And so it will be really cool to see what removing those inhibitions would do to our appreciation of a piece of art.
I agree.
Yeah.
At Imiis asks, how come sci-fi back then seemed more logical and looked better than sci-fi today in HD?
I disagree with the premise of the question.
Yeah.
I think, okay, first of all, there are a lot of issues with visual effects today, and that could be the problem, right? A lot of the visual effects companies are being overworked. I'm sure you've seen the stories online. Underpaid, overworked, rushed, and so therefore, some of the movies and TV shows you may see can look a little wonky lah from time to time. However, it still looks a lot better than the stuff we got in the 1980s and 90s lah.
A big part of it for me is I suspect it's the ease of use, right? Back then, and assuming you mean back then being around 20 plus years ago, well, actually, no, I would, I mean, probably closer to 30 years ago. I think the consideration was that you'd have to build it, right? You'd have to build the 3 boobs on a 3-boobed woman for that Arnold Schwarzenegger movie that sort of slips my mind right now.
Total Recall.
Total Recall. Thank you very much. And I think because you had to build it, you had to put more consideration into it. Compare the 1970s and the early 80s Star Wars to the George Lucas prequels, episodes 1, 2, and 3, when, yes, you can do it with a computer, but sometimes shooting a background in matte painting or creating a miniature of a flyover spacecraft over the city of Coruscant looks better because somebody had to toil over that for, 12 weeks or whatever. And I think that's partly the problem. You don't have to toil over it for 12 weeks. You don't have to pay someone to toil over something for 12 weeks. So you can just throw it on a computer, which means your design timelines get shorter and thus your production timelines get shorter. And an inexperienced director can and have and will potentially change on a whim about the color of a spacecraft or the shape of a wing on a car.
I will say this though, we are living in a golden age of science fiction. There is more science fiction available to us than ever before. In the past, networks, studios used to hate science fiction. The idea was that science fiction just couldn't sell. I remember J. Michael Straczynski had a tough time pushing Babylon 5, especially given the way that series was structured, where it was a 5 season arc, where it was a complete story told across 5 seasons. It was incredibly hard to sell to the networks because they were like, oh, yeah, but what if people don't tune in for every episode? How will they catch up? What if they forget? What's going on? We can't sell this to an audience, etc., etc. And he had such a tough time making that show. Meanwhile, if you look now on HBO, on Apple TV Plus, on Netflix, there is science fiction everywhere. And so I think you two have to be a lot more discerning when you're picking what science fiction to watch, because yes, there is a lot of illogical garbage out there, like the J-Lo movie, Atlas. But if you look at something like Apple TV's Foundation, which is one, absolutely stunning to look at, and a very good show, then you might reconsider your original statement lah. I mean, Apple TV has a lot of great science fiction. Dark Matter, Foundation, Silo. Everything they do, they seem to put in a lot of time and effort.
There is a really skewed vision of what science fiction is, right? When people say science fiction, they think Star Wars, they think Star Trek, that's it. However, Apple TV's got a new show out called Sunny, where Rashida Jones is investigating the disappearance of a family with a robot. And obviously there's some AI issues here.
Oh, that's very firmly in the category of science fiction, I think. I don't even think it's adjacent.
Science fiction doesn't just mean aliens and lightsabers and pew-pew laser guns, right? I think that is kind of the problem with the term science fiction. I think the initial question of science fiction being worse today or looking worse today than it did before, I think just potentially means you're watching the wrong stuff.
There is one point I will make to that though. And I've told this story before on an earlier podcast. And I had interviewed the great science fiction author Joe Haldeman, and he wrote the book The Forever War. And I'd interviewed him many years ago at the Singapore Writers Festival, and he told me something that was told to him. And I can't remember if it was Asimov that said it, but apparently science fiction is like a giant control panel with all of these buttons that cannot be unpressed. So alien invasion, you press it once, it's done. Time travel, you press it once, it's done. As in, that concept is no longer new or fresh. So it's your job as a writer or as a creator to come up with novel ways to address those same science fiction concepts. So a lot of the time when you see bad science fiction or you're talking about bad science fiction, it often has to do with the writer or the creator just not being ingenious enough when dealing with that specific subject matter. So the early science fiction authors had it somewhat easier because everything they were introducing was new and exciting. At Mandy LYT7 asks, I love psycho thrillers and haven't seen any good ones lately. Any recommendations? So I think it depends what your definition of a psycho thriller is, but I have a few recommendations. They may be slightly older, but I was thinking that if you haven't seen these ones, then these would be a good place to start. I really like Gone Girl by Fincher, which I think is the archetypal psycho thriller, if you will. So if you haven't seen Gone Girl, check it out. There's also a Danny Boyle movie with James McAvoy called Trance, which I really, really enjoyed. Disturbia, Shia LaBeouf. Gerald's Game, which is on Netflix. I don't know if you would consider Panic Room a psycho thriller, the Jodie Foster movie, but I really like that as well.
Yeah.
Also, Jordan Peele's Us is a great psycho thriller.
For TV, yeah, there's the classic You, but I'd say if you haven't, I say go further back. Go watch Mr. Robot. In fact, watch...
Oh, Mr. Robot's good.
Even Jessica Jones, right? Marvel's Jessica Jones was a psycho thriller.
David Tennant is the prototypical stalker asshole. Ex-boyfriend.
Yeah. And this is an oldie. I don't even know where you're going to find it, but I was going to say Dollhouse from 2009.
Whedon?
Yeah.
That's a good show.
Yeah, it's a good show.
Only one season or 2 seasons?
I think it got one season. So it's not a long show. And I think they rushed the ending because they were cancelled. But at least it got an ending. But Dollhouse is also good, I think, as a sort of psychological thriller thing.
Check those out. Let us know what you think. And let us know if you have any recommendations of things we may have not watched.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. At Travis T asks, are Star Wars and Marvel considered boys' brands? And if so, is having a girl-centric brand like Disney running it a mistake? I think I have a problem with your premise. I don't believe Disney is a girl-centric brand. I think that's my first big issue with your statement. I think if you were to say Disney is a children's-centric brand, I'd be more inclined to agree with you. But I think calling it a girl-centric brand, I think, is doing a disservice to the history of Walt Disney, the person, Walt Disney, the company.
Yeah, I think Disney is a family brand. You're right. Children/family brand. I think the acquisition of 20th Century makes them something different, and they're still trying to come to terms with what that is. An R-rated Deadpool movie might be a step in that direction. But I disagree with Disney being a girl-centric brand. I also disagree with Star Wars and Marvel being considered boys' brands. I think in the early days of their existence, yes, maybe there were more boys reading superhero comics, but I don't think that is true at all. I would say even from the 80s and 90s. I think girls were getting into them. I think these companies were making active efforts into introducing more female-centric characters, and not just female characters for male consumption.
Yeah.
I think Star Wars as well had strong female leads from the get-go. And so, no, I don't think they were boys' brands. But also, I don't have a problem with Disney's custodianship of Marvel or Star Wars. I think if you read the history of what happened in both of those companies, I think it's very clear that they had all fucked it up themselves before Disney came along. So there is a fantastic book called The MCU. It's a definitive history, not just of the Marvel Cinematic Universe as we know it, but of Marvel from its early days, its ventures into Hollywood and film, wanting to be a toy company, forgetting about comics and its value, as all of this stuff. Like, capitalism does weird shit to people. And I find it very difficult to brand companies as being boy-centric or girl-centric because I think it's all driven by economics.
For me, the only real girl-centric brands I can think of would be like Juicy Couture, that clothing brand, because I don't think they ever made anything for men, and
possibly Barbie.
Also Barbie, Mattel was the other one I was gonna say. But I think, not to get too far into it, because I think we've got a question later on that we can address all this, but I don't believe Disney is a girl-centric brand, and I don't think it's a mistake. I think probably my only thing to say with regards to Disney's mistakes with Star Wars would be the declaration that anything not written or produced by the hands of George Lucas is no longer canon. I think that was probably in some ways a mistake.
We'll talk about that in a second.
Yeah, I think that would be the only thing.
But I will say this. I disagree with you there, by the way.
Oh, okay. I can see from a storytelling point why you would do that. I can see as a producer moving forward why you want to do that. However, a part of me also thinks that had they not done it, they would have avoided a lot of these problems they're facing now.
I will get into that later as well.
Alrighty,
Another question, because I still disagree with that statement, my friend.
Okay.
Ooh, exciting. Okay, but I will say this. I think that all of these problems, yet again, boil down to economics. I think 5 years ago, you wouldn't be asking this question about Marvel. But the reason you're asking it now is because the incoming CEO, Bob Chapek, decided to push Kevin Feige to release as much Marvel content as possible because it was making the company billions of dollars. And so his logic was, the more we make and the more we give people, the more money we're going to get. And then when Iger came back, he's recently made a statement going, that was a mistake. We need to be a little more careful and curated in the content that we actually put out. Star Wars and Kathleen Kennedy came to this realization after Solo, right? When they first announced the prequel, we were supposed to get 2 Star Wars movies every year. That was going to be a standalone Solo project like Rogue One, like Solo, like the Lando movie that was supposed to happen. And then at the end of every year, around Christmas time, there would be a big tentpole production.
Mm.
And then after the failure of Solo, I mean, it wasn't really a failure. I still think it made $500 million, but it just wasn't as much as they wanted. After that failure, they went, okay, we're taking a step back. There's going to be less Star Wars because it's oversaturation for people. And so I think economics and capitalist tendencies have led to a problem for Disney.
Yeah.
But this also is nothing new. All of the people complaining about cash grabbiness need to look back at the history of George Lucas and Lucasfilm. Star Wars is the epitome of capitalism. Remember that after the first movie, they made parents buy an empty box with the promise of toys that were going to come. Star Wars created merchandising as we know it.
That was the most beautiful, most dastardly mustache twirling thing to do. I love it so much.
Genius. Yeah, I know. It was great. So every time someone talks about Disney being cash grabby, I'm like, wow, no, man. Star Wars has always been about the cash. Has always been about the cash.
I mean, a friend of mine once said George Lucas isn't a filmmaker, he's a toy maker.
And he's right.
Yeah, George Lucas makes toys. The movies are just ads for said toys.
But we'll come back to this.
We'll come back. Well, yeah, okay.
At Lego Fan in PJ, though, wants to know our thoughts on the trailer for Pharrell's Piece by Piece, which is NBC Universal's first production under their Lego film rights. His own thoughts are, 1, from the visual feed and look of it, did they retain Animal Logic's animation services despite being acquired by Netflix? And 2, will they release sets based on this movie in spite of the potential depiction of weed and bongs as these characters are apt to use? We're having a lot of questions about drugs this week.
This is a drug-centric week.
We looked it up. Animal Logic is not doing the animation for this. However, I have to say it looks very similar to what they've done in the past.
Yep.
I really enjoyed the trailer. I think it's a lot of fun. I'm still not sure why Pharrell decided to do a Lego version of his life story, but the trailer makes it look pretty inventive.
There probably won't be weed or bongs in this thing because I think it'll be for kids.
You say that, but in the trailer, there is already a scene where it's like smoke-filled and they're lying on a giant mixing desk.
No,
so
but
it looks like they're having a hallucination.
Right? That's a joke. You'll see, like, shit. You'll see some cartoons make that joke.
Actually, shit. Going back to Daphne's question, I'm sure people were high when they were making Adventure Time.
Oh, dude. You have to be high when you make Adventure Time. I don't think there will be many depictions of weed and bongs. Specifically, I think there will be cloud-filled rooms that parents will have to discuss with their children. But I don't know. I mean, I agree with you. I don't know why this is a thing.
I don't know why this is a thing, but after seeing the trailer, I'm interested to watch it because it looks like it could be something very cool. First of all, Bahir, it's directed by Morgan Neville.
A part of me wanted to just say like this feels like a real sort of like passion / up yourself project by making a Lego movie about your life. And then I wanted to go with the maybe it's just one long music video, like the kind that Michael Jackson used to do, those films with the multiple music videos in them kind of thing. But then I see that it's directed by Morgan Neville, and I'm like, Morgan Neville is a highly respected documentary filmmaker.
Like one of the best in the world. Like everything he's done is amazing. Best of Enemies, Roadrunner about Bourdain, 20 Feet from Stardom, Won't You Be My Neighbor, Bono and The Age of sort of Homecoming.
Yeah, he's a hardcore documentary filmmaker. So for that in itself just makes me go, actually, this could be quite interesting.
So I think the director gives us some confidence, but also I think there is an awareness on Lego's part as to how big their adult market is right now.
I like that idea. If anything, it introduces a new audience to the format of documentary storytelling.
But I really don't think it's a kid show.
I actually don't think there will be any sets based on this film.
Yeah, I don't think so either.
I think Lego's okay with somebody else using that form and that design, but I don't think Lego wants to put in the money to design a set like this.
I'm looking forward to it though. It's out in October. So piece by piece.
Exciting. Yeah. And our final one, I hope we left enough time to do this one, but Kailash Laxman asks, so I'm 4 episodes into The Acolyte. Is it my favorite Star Wars show? No. Is it the worst Star Wars media I've seen? Definitely not. But one thing which I find odd are the inconsistencies within the lore of Star Wars universe and the canon breaking. Would really like our take on this. Man, what a scary time to be a fan, as the fan base is more divided than ever. You wanna go with this?
So going back to what we were saying earlier, when Disney acquired Star Wars, they made a storytelling decision, like you said, Bahir, to get rid of all of the expanded universe stuff and call it Star Wars Legends. This is comic books, novels, LucasArts video games, all of that stuff, right? Because from a storytelling point of view, they wanted to give J.J. Abrams at the time a clean slate to restart telling the Star Wars story without being beholden to some of the ideas that have been introduced in the books. And so maybe people would still have some surprises. Also, it streamlines everything that kind of happened between the trilogies and the animated series, etc. It makes it very easy to tell a new story. So before we get into all of that, I don't know how you feel about this, Bahir, but I'm assuming you feel the same way as me with regards to canon, in that all canon is bullshit.
Yeah, I don't care.
I think as avid comic book readers, we know that canon is bullshit because comic book companies change shit all the time. Whenever they feel like it, nothing is canon. Is Gwen Stacy dead forever? No. Is Uncle Ben dead forever? No. Like Bucky Barnes, they just bring him back whenever they feel like it, right? Even though it could be defining moments for the character, which is why Spider-Verse is such a fun movie, because it's having so much fun with the idea of comic book canon and how stupid it actually is.
I'm now reading multiple Batman titles and they all have their own canon.
Pretty much. Alfred is dead in some of them. He's alive in some of them.
Yeah. There are the DC vampire canon stories. There are the zombie DC canon stories. So I think canon is relevant to the universe that you are in to a point.
Canon aside, let's talk about Star Wars lore. Because George Lucas was a terrible custodian of Star Wars. He allowed the comics and novels to run rampant. And there are so many examples of Lucas's own lack of restraint that had him completely forgetting the things that he did between 1977 and 1983.
Yeah.
Like, even when you look at the original movies versus the prequels, simple examples. Yoda went from the master that trained Obi-Wan Kenobi to the master that trained Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Yeah.
And we just kind of brush that aside and go, oh, well, whatever.
Yeah.
Obi-Wan Kenobi's outfit on Tatooine was supposed to be hermit clothing that he used to hide out. And it became the official robes of the Jedi.
Yeah.
When you think about how stupid that is, why is he dressed as a Jedi on Tatooine while hiding out from the Sith who are hunting him? It makes absolutely no sense. Even the way the Clone Wars are set up in the movies versus what they were in the EU stories is completely different. And this is all during George Lucas's time, mind you, before Disney came into the picture. I'm one of the stupid Star Wars fans. I've owned all of the books, I've read all of the comics, but for the longest time, the Clone Wars were this mythology in Star Wars lore. It was a very tiny part of the conversation. Luke and Obi-Wan mention it because Leia says it in her holographic message, right?
Yeah.
It was only in Timothy Zahn's Thrawn novels and then Michael Stackpole's X-Wing novels where some of the ideas behind the Clone Wars began to get fleshed out. So in Michael Stackpole's X-Wing novels, which are great, by the way, I mean, they're Star Wars legends now, but still worth reading, Wedge Antilles finds this thing in a museum that explains the Imperial propaganda about the Jedi Purge. And in the propaganda, the document states that the Jedi were killed by Palpatine after he learned about their plot to control the government. And only one Jedi, Darth Vader, was loyal to him. It's very similar to what we see in Revenge of the Sith, but it's not. So then, in Attack of the Clones, it seems to imply that there are multiple conflicts where the clones attack the Republic. However, with Lucas, it was one war.
Mm.
And also the clones were on the side of the Republic in the Lucas version of it.
Yes.
Meanwhile, in the Thrawn books, and there are multiple Thrawn books. There are some Thrawn books that are legends, and then there are some Thrawn books that were written after Disney's acquisition that are now part of canon.
Right.
But basically, in the Thrawn books, Thrawn plans to replace the Imperial's depleted forces with a clone army. And he's inspired to do so because there is an organization of cloners that had raised an army to assault the Republic before the Dark Times, before the Empire. So, like, even within Lucas canon and EU canon, there is so much nonsense. Like, before George Lucas did the prequels and introduced the stupid idea of Jedi celibacy, in the EU novels, it wasn't even a thing. Jedi could get married, have children. Luke gets married, has a child that trains in the Force. Leia and Han have 3 kids that train in Luke's academy. There's all of this stuff that happened. So canon wasn't canon as you know it. And so even under George Lucas's custody of Star Wars, it was a mess. So I think it's very easy to hate on Disney or hate on Kathleen Kennedy without knowing the history of the stories, or actually giving a shit about canon, because you know what? It doesn't matter.
I was going to say a thing, but, honestly, canon doesn't fucking matter. Like, just enjoy the thing for what it is. It's fine.
The thing I like about Disney's custodianship of Star Wars, at least to date, is their willingness to experiment. And sometimes the experiments work, sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah.
Mandalorian was a bold experiment. Telling that kind of story takes a big risk in the world of Star Wars. Because if you watch that first season of Mando, nothing really happens. But it's very kung fu, and it's very samurai, and it's very Western, and it worked lah. But then, under that same custodianship, under the great Dave Filoni, Boba Fett was a pile of shit. So, some experiments work, some don't. I think Acolyte is a very interesting experiment. I think Acolyte is also some of the most Star Wars stuff that we've seen in a very long time because it has Jedi and lightsabers. Andor is great, but you could remove the word Star Wars and have Andor just be a prison drama and it would be fine as well.
Yeah.
You don't even need the sci-fi Star Wars elements. It doesn't have to be a Star Wars show. And so I'm enjoying Acolyte because it's Jedi and lightsabers and mythology about the Force. And you know what? I think if we look at all of Star Wars as being told by unreliable narrators, that would make a lot more sense.
And I think that's what it is, right? None of this in universe is written down. There isn't a handbook that's been handed down from generation to generation, from Jedi Council to Jedi Council. Someone brought up a really interesting fact about how right now there's an argument about, I think, Kai Mundi, I think was his name.
Oh, you mean the character that nobody knows anything about except for the fact that he has a really large forehead?
Yeah.
I don't even know why anyone gives a shit about Kai Mundi.
But like the proof in the pudding with regards to how much nobody gives a shit about anything in the Star Wars universe is that in the prequel movies, Qui-Gon Jinn was attacked by a Sith, and Kai Mundi in the Jedi Council says, that's bullshit, the Sith no longer exist. Even in universe, they don't believe each other.
Yes.
So canon doesn't exist anywhere. Even in the universe of Star Wars, canon doesn't exist. All I can say is as a person who enjoys Star Wars, who enjoys the universe, I agree with you. I think Acolyte is the show that I'm most excited about because it's talking about a corner of Star Wars that I've never interacted with. It's telling me a story about Star Wars that isn't based around the Skywalker saga. And that really excites me. Whether someone was born yet or not is fucking irrelevant lah. Nobody gives a shit. I think anybody who's making those kinds of comments obviously have only read several books and not consumed the entire universe the way you might have.
But even then, even though I've consumed the entire universe and I own all of those classic comics, it doesn't bother me. Because I've always looked at Star Wars as a series of stories set within a universe. I don't expect everything to make sense. And because from the very get-go, it is rooted in the idea of an unreliable narrator.
Yeah.
He based it on Hidden Fortress. He based it on Kurosawa, and that's what those stories were like. It begins in the most typical storytelling fireside chat way.
Yes.
A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. We don't exactly know what happened, but here's what we've been told. Once upon a time, right? I mean, that's the whole idea of Star Wars. Obi-Wan Kenobi is the most unreliable narrator. He is a lying little shit that lies to Luke from the get-go.
And I think that was the cool part about Obi-Wan Kenobi. I think trying to redeem Obi-Wan Kenobi in the Obi-Wan TV show is unnecessary. You don't have to make this character cool. He already was cool. It's the same problem with the Solo thing, right? Learning how he got his name makes Han Solo less cool. Learning that he actually did the Kessel Run makes him less cool. Because I would have preferred if he was lying about it. I think thinking that there was this story out there that he's done this great thing that nobody's been able to is more interesting than you showing me him doing it. Because then you're just like, okay lah, he was telling the truth.
Yeah,
So what?
it's funny. Like, a lot of the time when Star Wars tries to conform to canon, it puts out the lesser works with regards to things like Solo and even the Obi-Wan series, right?
Yeah.
But when you do something like Andor, when you do something like Acolyte, when you break the mold, when you try to do something interesting, and you know what? Just loosely connect the threads. Because George Lucas was doing that from the get-go. The amount of retconning he did in
Within
order to like
the movies.
fix stuff
Yeah.
is amazing.
He just kept doubling back over himself. It was hilarious.
I'd recommend a couple of reads, actually. I think a lot of the time people read the comics and they may read the novels and they get carried away with certain ideas that they love from those books. And sure, by all means, because that's what fiction is supposed to do to us, right? We find things that we get attached to, and then obviously when things change, we get upset. But Taschen have these big volumes of the making of the prequels and the original trilogy. And they are a series of conversations and interviews that are strung together to form one giant book about how these things were made. And they speak to everyone from the set designers to Lucas to Ralph McQuarrie to John Williams, all of that. And I think that gives you tremendous insight on how these movies are actually made and how the lore is conceived, even down to how spaceships are designed, clothing is designed, what characters and aliens look like. I think all of that gives you some tremendous insight into how these worlds are built. And I think that might give you a better understanding of the stories that these individuals are trying to tell.
Yeah.
Man, I cannot tell you how little I care about canon. I think we may be alone on this one as fans of things, but I just want more good stories. And you know what, Kailash? Love what you love. Don't give a shit about the fan base. I know they're divided, but they just seem to be incredibly angry people on TikTok and Reels. Ignore that. If you love it, just enjoy it, man.
I mean, sort of the other quick parallel I can make for reasons only I can fathom would be the whole thing about Rings of Power, right? The Lord of the Rings TV show on Amazon Prime, and about how there are all these arguments, really just people tying themselves up in knots in trying to find a way to say that they're not racist when they say they don't want a black elf on their show.
Yeah.
You know, I'm just like, dude, you're racist. It's fine. Just accept it. Move on. You know, it's like, oh, they're quoting Tolkien's works and all that. I'm like, sure, but that's okay.
Tolkien himself was not racist for not having black elves.
Yeah.
He was writing based on his own world experience and worldview. And at the time, he was just writing what he knew. It didn't occur to him. It wasn't a problem for him.
I don't believe it would have been a problem for him.
I don't think so either, because nothing in his work seems to imply that he had those thoughts.
Yeah.
However, I think there is also a sense of nostalgia and false sense of glory in all of Tolkien's works.
Oh, true. Absolutely.
A lot of it is not very good.
To be clear, he wrote 4 very, very good books.
Yes, 4 tremendous works.
4 just absolute fantastic pieces of fiction. And I think even in those 4, reading it is like trying to listen to your grandfather talk, because suddenly he opens into song, suddenly he tells you about this other story about this thing that he thought about, and he reads poetry in the middle of it for no reason. But it's a great piece of book, and I think canon is only as far as you need it to be. If you don't need it, then that's fine. If you want it, then you'll have a problem. I don't even think canon's a guiding light. I think canon is just previous stories that have been told. That's all it is.
Thank you, Kailash, for your question, and thank you, everyone, for your questions. Keep them coming in, and we will try our best to answer them on Ask Us Anything. You know how to reach out. Goggler MY, all of our social media feeds. Email us at podcast@goggler.my or send us a WhatsApp on the Goggler hotline, 012-524-5208. Thank you so much for listening. This is the Goggler Podcast.